Are we live?
We are live.
Senator Boner. Here. Senator Case. Senator Nethercott. Senator Scott. Senator Chairman Driscoll.
Chairman Driscoll. Yes, thank you so much for having me. Members of the committee, thank you for your time. So I bring you House Bill 156. Its title and its beginning was 24-hour wine permits. Now it's referred to as alcoholic beverage permits. And I ask for your favorable consideration. So this bill comes as a request from the Wyoming wineries and has been vetted by the division that regulates and enforces liquor sales. It is also supported by the association that represents the Wyoming liquor retailers. This would give Wyoming wineries, those that are manufacturing their own products, the same ability distilleries and breweries have to host events off-premise for promotion and sales. Simply put, word for word, this is a mirror bill of HB 219, alcoholic beverage 24-hour permit that went into effect in July of 2019. That bill allowed distilleries to have these permits, while this bill gives that same ability to our Wyoming wineries, of which there are 9 in the state. It does not allow private citizens to be wine retailers, which would be a concern for enforcement and retailers alike. So by supporting this bill, we provide manufacturers off-premise permits annually, 12 annually for promotional events, and give our wineries a new tool to market their products and hopefully increase revenue. I will do a quick walkthrough of the bill. Here, page 1 states that the purpose of the bill is to create a 24-hour permit for winery permit holders to sell their manufactured wine offsite. Page 2 creates a new subsection G to House Bill 13, which we adopted in January of this year. Lines 7 through 9 on page 2 describe the off-premise events and gatherings the wine permit holder can sell at. Lines 11 through 14 limits the sale location to the area defined in the off-premise wine permit. Lines 14 through 17 limits the time period to just 24 hours. And lines 17 through 19 limit the number of permits to 12 each calendar year. And then page 3 there at the top identifies the role of our local licensing authorities to issue the permit and puts a maximum and minimum range between $10 and $50 that the authority may charge for these permits. On page 3, lines 5 through 7 and 12 through 14 were amended on the House floor to allow to clarify that wine permit and microbrewery permit holders may also hold a manufacturer's license. And with that, I ask for your favorable consideration and we'll stand for any questions that you might have.
Questions, committee? Ms. Sherwood, I have one. 12 off-premise wine permits in a year. How are they going to keep track of those? Because obviously these wine people run into different jurisdictions. They may be in a town for one, county for one, and a different county for another. Who keeps track of the 12 and makes sure that they don't go beyond?
Yes, that is a wonderful question. And my understanding is that the local clerk, so when you go to pull a special event permit, the clerk has your past records on file. But I would ask phone a friend here for clarification on when that goes outside of county jurisdiction. I am not sure.
Thank you. I see your phone a friend's nodding behind, so I'm sure he'll be up there. So thank you.
That's a great
further
question.
Questions? Nice job. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Mr. Mosier, would you like to come see us? We're trying to be pretty quick. We got 2 bills today I'm trying to get through, so I know you're capable of being slow.
Excruciatingly slow, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Mike Mosier, Wyoming State Liquor Association. We support this bill. The good bill sponsor reached out to us about, well, it was in February and shortly before the wineries reached out to us about this concept, and I had my hair on fire wondering what we're going to do. And then I called the liquor division, Mr. Montoya and Mr. Hunt, and they said House Bill 219, and I'd forgotten. So basically, this bill is just House Bill 219. We took whited out distillery and got our crayons and put in winery. That bill passed, I think, 30-0 out of the Senate. It's supported by all aspects of industry. It is the local licensing authority that issues these permits. You get them the same way you do a catering permit, if you will. And so the distilleries have 12. We mirrored that 12. If we need to increase that down the road, we can, but we wanted to just mirror those numbers. For example, catering permits, I'm sure you know, have been increased several times. And so we're going to start at 12 and take a look at it. The House Bill 13 amendments in this bill, there was some question as to whether the missing paragraphs were necessary or not. And I'm one of those guys that if you can err on the side of caution, do it. And so those 2 paragraphs are put back. Those were existing statute. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll take any questions. And please support the bill.
Thank you. I'm still back to 12. So the local authority does 12. Does that mean they get 12 in every jurisdiction? Because it's either 12, but if they do one in Crook County, how is Crook County or Sheridan County going to know that they've got a permit? Because, and I don't care, honestly, I think the catering permits ought to go away, but is there any way for them, does State Liquor Commission keep track of the catering permits? Or, because if not, basically the city of Hewlett could do 12 of them, and then the county could do 12 because they don't communicate.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it's a good question, and the liquor division is on if they care to elaborate further. But to some extent, it's like catering permit. If I am a retailer in Cheyenne and take out a catering permit in Laramie County, the city of Cheyenne probably won't know. So there is some degree of an honor system there. We just haven't seen a whole lot of demand because these permits are normally just used for promotional purposes. Hey, look at our wine, taste a little bit, because you can't do sales, for example. And so it's one of those things where, since it's just used for promotional, we just haven't found a lot of demand for them. And they are allowed limited sales. I should correct that. So to some extent, they'll have to track it themselves.
Very good. I don't like the catering permits, so it doesn't matter, but I was just doing it to wake everybody up. So any questions, committee? Thank you, Mr. Mosier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Did he just get up or something?
We have, welcome, Mr. Montoya.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm Tom Montoya. I'm Chief of Enforcement for the Department of Revenue Liquor Division, and with me today I have Administrator Nicole Novotny Smith. I just wanted to give my 2 cents on the reason for the House amendment and why we had to put in H&E. Basically, microbrewery permits and winery permits can sell their product at retail. Under Wyoming Statute 125401, which is Wyoming's Tied House laws, industry representatives, which are defined as microbreweries, wineries, brewers, distillers, rectifiers, importers, wholesalers, are prohibited to hold a license at retail. And so there was an exception in 2019. In fact, it was actually Representative Duncan's very first bill. And it was House Bill 212 that the legislature made that exception that microbreweries and wineries could hold a retail license along with their microbrewery or winery license. So it's really an exception that needs to be put back in, and that's the reason for it.
Thank you. Any further questions for Mr. Montoya? Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Montoya, can we go back to this? Is this permit is issued by the licensing authority? Wouldn't that mean that it'd be the underlying license authority that actually has the original license?
The microbrewery, Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, the microbrewery license or the winery license is issued by the local authority. You're correct. The manufacturing license is actually issued by the liquor division. So there's actually 2 licensing authorities involved. You know, we took out in House Bill 13, 124103B. And that statute said that a licensing authority could only issue 1 license per person defined in statute as an individual, partnership, corporation, LLC. But that really didn't apply here because there's really two licensing authorities involved. But it's really the exception that needs to be in there because of our tied house statutes.
Mr. Chairman, just follow up. So the temporary permit, can it be offered by, issued by someone that didn't offer the underlying winery permit?
Are you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, are you talking about the one-day permits in the first part of the bill?
Yes.
Yes, those are issued by the local licensing authorities. They're out, to answer Mr. Chairman's question too, it's only 12 period, not 12 per licensing authority. There's 122 licensing authorities in the state of Wyoming. And basically what's happening is they, in their local jurisdiction, whatever jurisdictions holds the license, that issues the license for that winery or that microbrewery, they should be notifying the clerk that they're doing that. It's basically an honor system. You know, and as far as microbreweries, it's on the books for a couple of years. We have not seen any abuses on that whatsoever. I doubt seriously we're going to see that with wineries either, as far as that goes.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm still trying to get there. So can a licensing authority that hasn't issued the underlying permit issue one of these temporary, so you can go to a different jurisdiction? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, they can. You can go to any jurisdiction in the state of Wyoming.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
Further questions, for Mr. Montoya? Thank you. Do we have anyone else online?
Mr. Chairman, no one has their hand raised at the moment online.
Okay, public testimony is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure?
Move the bill.
Bill's been moved. Any amendments? No amendments? Question on the bill?
Senator Boner,
Aye.
Senator Case,
Aye.
Senator Nethercott,
Aye.
Senator Scott,
Aye.
Chairman Driscoll.
Aye,
Mr. Chairman, House Bill 156 passes with 5 ayes.
thank you. Next will be House Bill 163, Federal Congressional Elections Residency. Representative McGuire been doing emails on your bill. Welcome.
Good morning, members of the committee, and thank you. I present to you House Bill number 163, Federal Congressional Elections. The issue that this bill sets out to address is that every year we have people from out of state that file to run for our sole congressional seat or one of our 2 U.S. Senate seats. Currently we have 3 representatives in Washington, D.C. out of a total of 535 in the U.S. Congress and Senate, which simple math, that's 0.0056% representation in Washington, D.C., less than 1%. And I would submit to you that since several of you served with our former Senator Mike Enzi, those are the type of people that we need in Washington, D.C. People who know Wyoming, understand Wyoming, and are there to represent Wyoming to the best of their abilities. We don't need to have one of those seats being used as a stepping stone for something else or some other higher purpose. So the criteria to run for U.S. Senate and U.S. House are set out in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 1 for the House, and Article 1, Section 2 for the Senate. And it says that the age to run for the House, you have to be 25 years of age. For the Senate, 30 years of age. U.S. citizenship for the House, 7 years. For the Senate, 9 years. And then it goes on to say to be an inhabitant of the state when chosen. Today, we use the generic term residency. While debating the framework of the U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia back in 1787, the framers argued for state residency requirements of 1 year, 3 years, or 7 years. And this is set out, there's a congressional white paper, which I referred to, and there's also the dicta in several cases, which talk about these, the debates. And ultimately, the framers could not reach an agreement. So they left it up to the states to set their own residency requirements for these offices. So for many years, the states drafted their own residency requirements to run for U.S. Congress or U.S. Senate, typically anywhere from 1 year to 5 years. Wyoming was 1 year. In 1964, during a administration where we had a president that had a dog with long ears and used to like to pick him up by his ears. He had a friend by the name of Pierre Salinger, who was a very interesting individual, very gregarious, classically trained pianist. And there was a senatorial seat that came open in the state of California, and Pierre Salinger was sent out to be put into that senatorial seat. He didn't meet the residential requirements for that seat, but he was still appointed and was given that seat. It was challenged, and in the California Supreme Court, in an extraordinarily narrow reading of the Constitution, the California Supreme Court said that a state may not incorporate any particular measure of duration of time of residency. And so based on that case, later on in other states, other people challenged the residency requirements. And in 2 federal cases, those challenges were upheld. And so finally, there was a Supreme Court case, which actually was dealing with term limits, where in the dicta of that decision, the Supreme Court went on to say that states may not establish a term of inhabitancy for any of these seats. In other words, they may not go beyond the Constitution. So the current case law is that a state may not impose a length of residency to run for US Senate or US Congress. So in this bill, I'm telling people, well, I'm sorry, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. What this bill goes on to say is that if you are currently a resident in another state, and I think the term and receiving the benefit of that residency, then you can't come to Wyoming and claim that you're a resident and run for US Senate or US Congress. And I would use the example, if we had a homeless person who was hitchhiking across I-80 and they get to Cheyenne and they walk into the Secretary of State's office and they want to run for US Congress or US Senate, there's nothing in this bill that would prevent them from doing that. On the other hand, if you have somebody who's living in California, has a California resident fishing license, sends their kids to California college and claims residency to get a lower tuition for those kids, well, you're claiming residency in California, you're receiving the benefit of that residency. You can't come to Wyoming and fill out the form and say, I want to run for US Congress. You have to choose one or the other. Just like if I went to California and I wanted to get a resident fishing license, they would say, no way, because I currently have a resident Wyoming fishing license in my wallet in my pocket. You have to choose one or the other. It just makes sense. So that, in a nutshell, is what this bill does, is it has people choose one or the other. And also it is notable that House Bill 148, which honestly I lost track of, but that was a bill to revise the filing fees. Currently, it costs $200 to file for US Congress or US Senate in the state of Wyoming. That bill proposed to raise the fee up to $750. So with that, members of the committee, I stand for questions.
Questions for Representative McGuire. Senator Case, your mic's on. Sorry about that. Very good.
Question.
Senator Nethercott. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative McGuire. Will this bill affect any current elected member of Congress from Wyoming?
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I appreciate you asking that. That question has come to me, and no, absolutely not. This was not aimed at anyone current or past at all. It came from my mom, whom some of you know, who said something to the effect of, this is a problem. What do you do with yourself all day? And I said, I think I'll try and fix that. So that's the genesis of the bill. No,
Sir, I've never heard a more honest answer.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Scott.
and as one who's sat beside his mom in the Senate when she served there, that sounds very much like her.
Further
Mr. Chairman.
questions? Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand and agree with the intent. Just want to make sure that we're getting there with the language and, coming back to this phrase of, going back to they shall not receive, claim, or currently be claiming any residence. Just want to make sure that it's not going to preclude somebody who has say a cabin in, in the Black Hills of South Dakota or something like that. When you say residence, you mean residency, or it seems like we use residence and residency interchangeably. I'm wondering if that's the intent, and maybe just a little bit more information for me would be helpful.
Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate you asking that. So if you go to the election code 221102, Romanet 30, and it has the definitions of residency with regard to an elector. And so that is set out, and it has the exceptions. For example, if you have somebody who is based here, they're in the military and they're temporarily deployed and things like that, all of those things are taken into account. With regard to, and we all have friends that have a house in Arizona, maybe they have a car down there with Arizona plates, that does not make you a resident of Arizona. If, however, while you're living in Arizona, you go vote in the local school board election, well, then there's going to be a piece of paper where you affirmatively say, I am a resident of Arizona. And to me, if there is some form there where you have made an affirmative statement or you have received the benefit of that residency somewhere else, then that precludes you from running. And I would just add, so the bill seems a little bit long, but that's because it goes through it revises the form that we all filled out. And all of us signed the same form, which says, I'm a resident of Wyoming for at least in my district or Senate precinct for at least a year. And if you're a governor, running for governor, that you've been a resident for at least 5 years.
Further questions? Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, practical question. I can't ever see one of these candidates that really lives somewhere else winning an election. Mr. Chairman, do they bring in enough money to run a campaign to have any economic impact?
Representative McGuire.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is a question I don't know. Obviously, there's no fiscal note on this. However, I would have agreed with you 2 years ago. And then we had a candidate come out from, basically nowhere, throw a massive amount of money at a race and come in second, which that was pretty much when my mom said, let's fix this. And that's because things have changed. And I agree, we always had perennial candidates and they were just kind of a nuisance. And some of you will remember it was about 6 years ago, we had a candidate who came to a forum and said, yeah, this is the first time I've ever been to Wyoming. And of course, added what a beautiful state it is. That's a problem. And, we had a first lady who went to another state and ran for Senate and won. And that was basically a placeholder until the next step in that career. And again, I would go back to the Senator Enzi example. We just cannot afford, we don't even have 1% in Washington, D.C. We cannot afford to have somebody buy one of our elected positions as a placeholder for their further political career. We need people who are representing the state of Wyoming and who understand the state of Wyoming. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions? Senator Northcott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative McGuire. Looking on page 2, really lines 12 through 18. The language is there's a number of concepts within it. And I think the first word that struck me was on line 14, which at the time of knowingly seeking nomination or election, that word knowingly, I think that's pulled in from other statutory sections. So I understand that it's just an adoption of poorly drafted language. So I won't mess with that, Representative McGuire, but just note that concept is kind of awkward. But then it appears that moving down on lines really 16 through 18, what we're really talking about, clarify if I'm incorrect, is 2 different concepts. One is whether or not a candidate is claiming a different state as their residence, and or 2, whether or not they receive the benefits of any other state. There are 2 concepts there to qualify that are separate and distinct. Is that correct?
He shook his head, yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
And I can put that, Mr. Chairman, I can put that on the record. So yes, the answer there is yes. And again, the reason that I added the two concepts is again, going back to the individual who maybe lives in Arizona and gets an Arizona fishing license. During the duration of that fishing license, that person is receiving, saying affirmatively to the state of Arizona, I'm an Arizona resident and I want to fish for less money than it would cost if I got a non-resident fishing license. So long as that person is doing that, residency has a lot to do with the intent. And, oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, Representative McGuire, and I'll give you, because I'm asking technical questions to make sure that the language makes sense. Line 16, the word receive in that first concept doesn't make sense to me. So the first concept is the candidate has claimed or currently claiming residency in another state? If so, not qualified. Or if the candidate is receiving benefits from another state, not qualified. So that word receive on line 16 seems to be conflating the ideas, and I think potentially obviating the word or and instead making it an and. I'll give you a minute to process that.
Mr. Chairman, the great legal minds, not that I have a great legal mind, great legal minds can often differ. And so the intent of the drafting was so that there could be two different ways of looking at it. Claiming residency. So for example, I claim residency of Wyoming. On the other hand, I also receive the benefits of that residency. My kids are going to the University of Wyoming. I'm claiming resident tuition for those kids. So I think that what I was trying to do was take into effect that there are two different ways to claim and or receive the benefits of residency. The language is not perfect and is subject to be argued, and I'm open to if someone has better language. Again, the intent is aimed at the out-of-staters who are clearly out-of-state residents who want to submit an application in the state of Wyoming. And maybe if the primary looks like it's crowded and it's going to be close, throw a bunch of money at it and maybe come away as a winner. So that's what it's aimed at.
Thank you. Further questions?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I don't have my computer. What was the vote in the House?
I think it was 60-0. I don't think there was any vote against it. In fact, it was 60-0.
So an amendment wouldn't kill it on conference.
Again,
It's ours now.
Yes, well, I recognize the significance of making an amendment.
Further questions for Representative McGuire? Thank you. Anyone from the audience? Forward, please. Welcome. Mr. Sean. Sean. I'm learning. I'm new to the committee, so I'm being coached by both sides. When I mispronounce, you can feel to correct me. So, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. This bill, our
You have to
office.
introduce yourself
Oh,
after I
thank you.
butchered
Yes,
your name.
Kai Schoen, Secretary of State's office.
Thank you.
This particular bill, House Bill 163, our office has no position on this bill. We do appreciate the work of Representative McGuire on this bill, the creativity certainly behind it and the purpose behind it. As far as our office and our election applications, there is an impact to our candidate filing website. We'll have to accommodate the change in the application for nomination for federal candidates. And so there's a one-time cost. It's about $7,200 to change the website as well as our voter registration system, those components that interface with candidate filing. Outside of that, I really have nothing further to offer to the committee, but would answer any questions.
Many questions. I have one, and actually is off the bill. Has the Supreme Court weighed in on local races are, i.e. the 4 electeds and legislative races as far as residency requirements? Can we mess with those without running afoul of court decision?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know the exact answer to that, but I do know with local races and races specific to those states, that generally is reserved to the states to dictate.
Thank you. Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Sean, would your department, your agency be in charge of enforcing this statute? And have you thought about that? Is it enforceable? And what does that mean?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, as far as whether or not we would enforce that, it's not necessarily contemplated by this bill. However, if there were a candidate that we became aware of that someone was questioning, their particular residency or claiming the benefits of residency in another state, that would certainly come to our office and we work with the AG at that point.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. So that would mean that someone, would it be your AG, the person assigned to the Secretary of State's office, or someone else at the AG's office would bear that? And how would that work?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, so in the instance that there were a complaint, alleging that there was a potential violation, that would come to our office in the form of a complaint. We have an official complaint form on our website. And at that point, we do review it. And if we see that there is some merit to this, at that point, we engage the Attorney General's office.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions, Ms. Shaw? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any further testimony in the audience? Any further testimony? Do we have anyone online?
Mr. Chairman, no one has their hand raised.
Last chance. Public testimony is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure?
I'll move the bill.
Amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
There you go.
I knew it was coming. There's another cop.
All right, page 2, line 16, strike receive.
Same amendment on page 4.
Same amendment on page 4.
Same amendment on page 6.
Conforming amendment throughout the bill to strike the word receive. And replace that word on line 17, we're on page 2, after the word or.
Okay.
Conforming amendment throughout.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't hear the second part.
Yeah.
On line 17 on page 2,
Mhm.
after the word or, that's where we insert receive to bifurcate the two separate concepts.
Okay.
Okay, got it.
I'm sorry, I still need it one more time.
Sure. So on page 2, line 16, we are striking the word receive and reinserting it on line 17 after the word or.
And that'll conform all the way through, Judy. There's 3 or 4 times it hits.
Mr. Chairman, can we,
Senator Case.
Sure.
just in discussion, I'm having trouble with what the receive the benefits of really means. And how enforceable that is, I guess, in a way. I could think of a congressional person at one time was a resident of Wyoming, was running for United States Congress, but did not receive the benefits of having an in-state fishing license, if I remember it. Something like that, it can get kind of tangled out there on these little things.
Senator Nethercott.
Mr. Chairman, I don't disagree, Senator Case. I'm just trying to fix the language so that it makes sense, not make the policy decision about it.
Well,
Senator Case.
what if we just got rid of receive?
Well, I think it makes the second concept nonsensical. So the first concept with the bill is the candidate claimed or currently claiming residency in another state? That means, do they claim that they live somewhere else?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying with respect, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, but with
This-
respect to the benefits, the noun, you need a verb to go with that noun? Is that what you're trying to say?
Wow, English teacher. Senator Case.
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, that the concept, as the representative provided in his bill, that the second concept in the bill
Mhm.
is whether or not, regardless of what the candidate is claiming, whether or not they are receiving benefits from another state would be a second
Mhm.
element that would need to be established for the qualification. And it's an or.
I recognize myself. I actually thought that Representative McGuire's explanation was a great one. If you've got a fishing license, you've got a term there. I do think it's the receive is there. And I think it's reasonably clear to me that
Mhm.
you know when you're receiving a benefit, be it a tax benefit, a fishing license, something that you acknowledge by signing your name to, it clearly needs to be there. And I think that, to me, it is definable.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Case.
no, that's fine. You're okay with moving the word receive?
I am. I
Yeah.
think it helps.
And let's just call for the question.
Any further debate before we go to the question? Okay, we're there. Senator Nethercott, did you want one more?
Just trying to fix the language, Mr. Chairman, that's all.
Question called. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Amendment has passed. We're back on the bill.
So, Mr. Chairman, along those lines, for the expansiveness of what that provision now says. So if I receive a benefit associated with residency from another state, maybe even something as insignificant as a fishing license, I would not be qualified to run for that office. That's the consequence.
That's my belief. It's a good purity test. I'm actually for it.
Who doesn't love a good purity test? Wonderful.
I had to bring it into the conversation.
America.
We're going to that next and more in depth. So
God bless America.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, suppose you have, as a number of my constituents do, you work out, you live in Wyoming, you work out of state part of the time, and you have to register a car in some other state, because I think most states are like Wyoming and having a relatively short time period
30 days.
where you've got to register the car. People don't always do it. But would that be construed
Yes.
as receiving a benefit of living somewhere else?
In my opinion, no, because it's forced on you. It's not a voluntary deal. It's a requirement to work there. And it may be the same. You may be required, if you own a house in Arizona, to get a post office box with an Arizona address. That's a requirement of them to receive mail there. I don't see that that's a problem unless you voluntarily say, I am a resident of Arizona. You know, my father lived in Arizona for 20 years in the wintertime, fought nonstop with the state of Arizona, whether he was a resident or not, because he would not give up his Wyoming residency.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott. I think that's a wonderful pragmatic way of interpreting the express language of the statute and understanding maybe the spirit of it, but that's not what it says. So if you want to have an exception, except for incidental or except for ancillary, then you need to put that in. But it says you are not qualified to be a candidate if you receive benefits associated with the residency of any other state, period. It's not really up for interpretation, whether you have a JD or not, right?
How can we come back and fix laws when you fix them all before we start?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Scott.
another question here. Look on line 16. We removed the receive, claim or currently be claimed. The currently be claiming, I understand. The claim by itself, what's the time frame on it? You may have a year ago claimed to be a resident of, say, state of Colorado to the south of us. You may have moved, but within the year you had claimed to be a resident. Is that open to trouble? Should we remove the word claim and just have currently be claimed?
Is there
Mr.
another copy?
Mr. Chairman, I think Senator Scott makes a good point. I think it would be limited to reading the section in total. So the claim would apply to whether or not at the time of knowingly seeking nomination or election. Certainly ambiguous in define, fact finding when that is, but that would be limited in scope to when the candidate was knowingly seeking nomination.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, so the argument is that claim is all right here because you have to read it in context of everything else.
In para materia.
Ooh, Mr. Chairman.
English back again.
Oh, that was Latin. Wow.
Look out.
Nova's English teacher was doing it to me.
So, Mr. Chairman, I have kind of a, so when we're saying this word residence, okay, we're judging it by the definition in our statute. Okay, this is ours is lines 8 through 10 here. Residence is the place of a person's actual habitation. The construction of this term shall be governed by the following rules, okay? Couldn't we get in a mess where another state, they claim residence, but their definition is somehow different? And then our definition is this, and so we're trying to judge their claims in another state by our definition. And is that potentially, and the habitation, that sounds like you might have two houses. Part of the time you live here, and part of the time you live there. I'm starting to weaken. Help me with that.
Is there another copy?
How's your
page
purity
2.
test, Senator Case? Ooh. Oh, those purity tests, it gets complicated.
I'm libertarian, so it really doesn't matter.
Maybe a discussion with the representative about a forum primacy if there's a dispute over which residency of the candidate.
Certainly
Wyoming,
Wyoming rules.
Wyoming law will trump.
So you could have a resident fishing license in another state based on their criteria about a residence. And it, whether that state issues a fishing license to someone or not, it is that state's business, not our business.
Representative McGuire, you have the platform.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, and it's a constant battle. So we don't always get the full statute when you get the bill.
No.
And so, again, if you go to the definition of residency for a person to become an elector, again, to cast a ballot, it goes on and talks about the residency as a place where a person has current habitation and to which he, when he is absent, has the intent of returning. It goes on to talk about shall not lose residency merely by reason of his presence or absence due to employment, student, working in a hospital, military, being transferred out militarily. So there's a whole laundry list of items that go in here. And with regard to talking about the benefit of residency, so I would go back to the example, the home in Arizona. If I go buy a license plate for my car that I keep in Arizona, the price is no different if I'm a resident of Arizona or if I'm not. I'm just walking in and I'm buying a license plate. Same thing with Wyoming. That's why the term benefit of is key. If I were to walk in to buy plates in Arizona and they said, are you a resident? Because if you are, the price is lower, then I'd be receiving the benefits of that. And that's why I used the example of the fishing license. If I buy a resident fishing license in Arizona, I'm declaring I'm a resident, so therefore I get a lower rate on my fishing license as opposed to if I'm an out-of-stater. Same hunting deer, whatever. If you're claiming to be a resident so you can get the benefit of residency, then in my mind, that says affirmatively, I'm claiming this other state as my residence, not Wyoming.
Representative McGuire, and that's regardless of what their terms are, because what Senator Case brought up, their definition of residence might be 30 days to qualify for the resident license. Wyoming, it might be a year. But you're saying regardless of what their rules are, if you claim anything under those terms, that something that says residency, that's the qualification. Lawyer, is that how it's going to read? Senator Nethercott, excuse me, I called you by the wrong name.
I-
It's nice to have
yeah.
a staff attorney on board.
Uh, Let's litigate it. I mean, I don't think I mean, I appreciate, I just looked up, the reference, the additional definitions associated with residents. And I don't know that those definitions necessarily address the concerns associated with what we have discussed here. I think they add to the argument associated with the practical effect, but I doubt that, particularly looking at some of these in real time, these congressional candidates that might be interested in running, that they would claim residency or have that be challenged as a result of their, work at a hospital on a rotation, moving around the country, or, in the military, in active duty type of situation. So I'm not sure that those concerns would alleviate these, but I guess we'd have to leave it up for those candidates to decide whether or not they're qualified or not, based on their understanding of those other states' benefits that they may or may not be receiving.
Senator Boner.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I guess I'm inclined to support this bill because we do have that additional limitation on lines 14, 15. It's only during the time of the actual candidacy. So if they're actively running for office in Wyoming, yet they're still wanting to get that, save a couple bucks on a fishing license or whatever the case may be in another state. That's just, I'm not sure if we want to support somebody who's going to be that careless in their campaign. So I guess I don't see the problem with understanding ambiguity. And frankly, it seems like we pass laws all the time that have ambiguity, and maybe that's okay. There is another branch of government that takes care of those details on a case by case basis. We can't try to litigate that here today. I'm for the bill. I think that, I'm certainly be open to more amendments to offer clarity.
There's no starving lawyers clause. It's okay.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, I just don't think we can, try to litigate every last outcome here today.
Further discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could just address one item there, and nothing's going to happen unless there's a complaint. And then if there is a complaint, the Attorney General's office has discretion as to whether or not they want to pursue that complaint. And so there's prosecutorial discretion involved, and then they can take it to the next step or not. So it's not, again, the genesis would be, there's going to be an obvious issue before somebody brings a complaint. And then the Attorney General's office will have the opportunity to exercise their discretion. They're not going to be, again, it will be a seriously considered question before there's litigation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You've won. Don't make us ask another question. Question.
Senator Boner.
Aye.
Senator Case.
Kind of a reluctant aye.
Senator Nethercott.
Aye.
Senator Scott.
Aye.
Chairman Driscoll.
Aye. Thank you. Good job.
House Bill 163 passes with 5 ayes.
Thank you.
Guess we're done, right?
Representative Gray, you've been waiting for weeks for this.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Okay.
You have 23 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 75, voter identification, is a voter ID bill. Voter ID is a step in keeping our election statutes tight and ensuring there is an environment where it is difficult to commit fraud. It's a best practices issue. There's been a lot of work on this over 3 years, and I'm really proud of the coalition that has come to support this bill. This bill will also help to ensure confidence in our elections. Now I'd like to go through the bill. Page 2, line 21, you can see the bill amends in for the purposes of voter registration. One identification is adequate proof of identity. And then we move to the voter ID part when you're voting at a polling place. That's on the next page. And we're in the windup here. Page 3, lines 4 through 21, and page 4, lines 1 through 10. It says when voting in person, the following types of ID will be allowed. This is really, so first you have a Wyoming driver's license. That includes the digital driver's license in the definition, a tribal ID card, and we also amended that over on the House side. So that's recognizing the previous tribal ID cards, not just the one that was created last year, but that's the previous ones as well. Third, a Wyoming ID card issued under WS 318-101. That's the DOT identification card. Then a valid United States passport, a United States military card. Then moving to page 4, a driver's license or ID card issued by any state or outlying possession of the United States. That was an amendment over in the House. Then photo ID issued by the University of Wyoming, a Wyoming Community College, or a Wyoming public school. That was also added on over on the House side. And then 8th, a valid Medicare insurance card, which will be repealed at the end of the decade. That was after a lot of work with AARP, and I think they're on the Zoom to testify about their support of the bill. So that's the valid Medicare ID card. Then page 4, lines 16 through 22. This is really where you get the follow through after the windup, where it lays out that a person votes only if a person presents acceptable ID when voting in person, either early or on the day of the election. So it's early or on the day of the election in person. If they do not show ID, they can vote a provisional, and pursuant to 22-15-105, they have that period of time allocated in statute to show ID for that ballot. Lines 10 through 13, this lays out the voter ID requirement does not apply to absentee ballots. Page 6, lines 1 through 3, this amended language lays out that an individual may be challenged for failing to show an acceptable ID. Page 6, lines 13 through 17, this language directs the YDOT in their renewal application for a driver's license that it directs them to say in that renewal application that an individual will need to show acceptable ID in order to vote. And if they do not wish to renew, they can attain the Wyoming ID card that was discussed earlier. And page 7, lines 6 through 8, it allows the fee for the ID card, the Department of Transportation ID card, to be waived if the applicant requests an identification card that shall be used only for voter identification purposes. That's the bill. Thank you.
Very good questions for Representative Gray. Seeing another comment.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, how do you feel about adding a fishing license?
Yeah. Well,
Is that a flinch?
yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will say that the definitions, we did debate those highly over in the House, and I think we did debate them to a heavy level. So we added a couple different things there as we discussed.
Senator Scott, I'm sorry, reading costs.
Mr. Chairman, suppose the ID that a person has and is going to rely on is the driver's. I think probably the most common, Mr. Chairman. And day of the election or the day before, somebody steals your wallet, and it includes that ID and probably your Medicare card as well. What happens then?
Representative Gray.
Thank you, Chairman Driscoll and Chairman Scott. So a couple things on that. For one, you have the period allocated in 22-15-105 to go by and get a paper one. And I think you could, we've talked about this with the clerks. I think you could use your old ID as well if you had that laying around. So there'd be a couple other options, hopefully you'd have your passport also. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple answers to that, I'd say.
Senator Scott, follow up.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
It's all right. We're going to get you there.
I am a little concerned about this one because I know there was a period where what I would have had would have been the driver's license. And if something happened to that in the immediate time before the election, I'd have a problem. Now I got a passport, but not everybody's got a passport.
I guess I've got a thought on that is, could they not go back to the original voter ID back at the courthouse on the provisional and verify it? Because don't we have to use an ID to
Register.
Yeah.
register the first time? So they just go back, do a provisional and go back and look. I'm seeing a nod. from
Yeah,
the
Mr.
back.
Chairman,
So-
they'd have
so
that.
It fixes itself, Senator Scott, in the fact that
Okay.
you cast the provisional, it says we're gonna check up, make sure you're actually there. And they follow it up and they've got it off your original registration.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I could, and that 22-15-105, yeah, you'd cast a provisional and you'd make good on that. I mean, when you went to the office, the local office, you'd automatically get a Wyoming ID card or a paper form of the driver's license and the paper form of the driver's license that you get when you renew while you're waiting for it to be sent, that counts, as well as your old driver's license would count, which hopefully you wouldn't have in your wallet.
Further questions? I have one. Did you think about, and this is really kind of off the wall, but when you live in the backwoods like I do, all your polling people know you personally. Is there a thought that you could be allowed to cast your ballot because you actually know the polling people? I walk in and, we've got coffee there. We know them all. And it's like.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it okay if I address it? Thank you. Mr. Chairman, we have, we contemplated that issue, which has been brought up over the years, and decided not to put in there. I think there's some equal protection concerns on that language. And just talking to individuals that live in those areas, I think that the upside of having this confidence, I think, is more than some of the downsides associated with maybe some of the vicissitudes that could occur that I think could be addressed via the procedure in 22-15-105. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions? Further question. Thank you, Representative Gray.
Thank you very much.
Anyone in the audience?
Online.
Yeah, we've got a couple. I thought the big guy might want to come up. Mr. Secretary of State, welcome. First time in front of my committee. I'd like to torment you a little bit. I won't.
Well,
Welcome.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. It will be my pleasure to be here for the first time. I won't take a lot of time. I just want to say that.
Got to identify yourself.
Oh, yes, I thought the big guy did it. No, it's my first time. And none of you know me. Edward Buchanan, middle name Allen. Do you need my ID? Is that what you're asking for?
Now on, that's
Secretary of State. So I just wanted to point out for the committee, all the collaboration that went into this particular piece of legislation with my office. And we also worked extensively with the county clerks on this. The House put on some amendments, some of which came actually from the standing committee, which I think improved the bill. It put any concerns that we may have had, there weren't many, to rest, because you really have every available type of identification to be used in this case, so that nobody has to feel like that there's an ID that they can't get or something like that. Because one of the important things that I emphasized early on was this would in no way could be argued to be disenfranchising any voters. And that's why you see the extensive lists of IDs that are applicable here. I worked very hard and Senator Case, when we had a committee meeting out on the Wind River reservation. And many of you probably participated in the legislation to bring tribal ID forward. So we're really working hard to make sure that everybody has access to an ID, so that when this comes into being, that everybody will have that opportunity. I think voting is accessibility and opportunity and security. And that's what I focus on and our office is focused on. And I'm here to support the bill. I'll leave it at that. I'll answer any questions you may have, but I don't want to take a lot of time because I know you're short on time. So,
Questions for the Secretary of State? See none. Thank you. Oh, Senator Boner.
Just so I understand technical aspect, maybe this is a question for the sponsor. The sole purpose of the ID is to verify that the person, match the name to the photo. It's not to verify residence or anything like that. That's the sole purpose, right?
That's correct. This is separate and apart from the registration process. This is an echo chamber right here.
Further questions? Further questions? Senator Case, we're not going to let you off the easy yet.
So, Mr. Chairman, I guess, how many instances of voter irregularity or voter fraud or people trying to vote when they're not supposed to, do you have documentation about?
According, Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, according to the Heritage Foundation statistics, I'm going to say that there have been only 3 or 4 instances over the course of several, I'd say 2 decades of instances of voter fraud, but it does occur. And what I would say to that, and this is the same thing with physical and cybersecurity. I'll go to the commissioners' meetings and I'll say, I want you to address physical and cybersecurity for our voting systems. And I'll get the response, well, we don't have a problem with that in Wyoming. And my response back is always, when you have a problem, then it's too late. With regard to the particular area of voting, I always point to the fact that many of the local races, not so much maybe the congressional races, statewide races, many local races are decided by 1 vote or less. I know in Goshen County many years ago, I had a commissioner win by 1 vote. So it matters. And fraud by its nature is it's insidious. It's surreptitious. You don't usually see it. It's only comes to light when it's discovered, because that's the nature of fraud. And so when I think about the low number of instances of fraud, I'm very grateful, because Wyoming is a small population, as Chairman Driscoll mentioned. A lot of us know each other, but our population is growing. We're up to 581,000 people now. And I would say this, just to sum this up, nobody says, well, a little bit of fraud in my elections. I don't really mind a little fraud, as long as it's just a little bit. I don't think anybody ever says that. And so if we could have a law to help prevent that, why wouldn't we do that, I guess is, and so on the other side of that, when I hear people say, well, but then that's going to prevent so-and-so from voting, or that's not the case. We have worked very hard and been diligent over the course of more than a year now to ensure that every Wyoming citizen under this bill will be able to produce an ID, whether or not they have one already, or they can get one free based on some of the amendments that came from the House. So that's a long-winded answer, Senator Case, but I appreciate the question and the opportunity.
I have one comment on this person. Nobody comes and volunteers when fraud's going on. So you really don't know how much is actually out there. The preventative measure to me is valuable, because no one steps up and says, I cheated your system. They just come back and do it again.
Mr. Chairman.
Isn't that right, Mr. Secretary of State?
Great point, Chairman Driscoll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Buchanan. I understand all of these efforts are focused on the voters committing the misconduct. I've had experience in my local voting center here in Laramie County, where as a sitting senator, I was rejected at the poll booth because I didn't have my ID with me. Fun fact. So do you have any concerns about poll workers discouraging these voters, seeing an ID and not finding it acceptable to their liking? Who makes that determination? What if it's damaged or it's bent and they reject that voter at the poll in the same way that I was rejected?
You still feel rejected, Senator?
Every day.
Chairman Driscoll, Senator Nethercott, that shouldn't occur if you have a valid ID. If it's bent or mutilated or you can't be identified, then that's obviously an issue. But what this comes down to is training. And our office, in conjunction with the clerks in every aspect of our elections, does a tremendous job in training our poll workers and election staff in all of these areas. And so I don't see an issue with that. We haven't had issues with that. I don't know. You didn't really describe the specifics of that. But I've always made the promise to voters statewide, because we're a small state and we do know each other. Because we have had instances come up where a question comes up at the polls and they call us And we are receptive and we are ready to solve the problem. And I've told voters time and time again that I will be the first to go anywhere I can to ensure that every eligible voter votes in the state of Wyoming.
Story Jim.
I'll be there.
Thank you. I think we have Mr. Laycock in the waiting room, maybe. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning, I should say, Mr. Chairman and Committee. I'm Tom Laycock, Associate State Director for AARP. We're a nonpartisan organization representing 83,000 members in the Cowboy State. I'm here today to speak in support of the provision for that Medicare cards be used as voter ID. Over the past 2 years, AARP Wyoming has asked those sponsoring voter ID bills to help us protect the voting rights of Wyomingites who are aging and may not always carry a state ID. A 2006 New York University study tells us nearly 1 in 5 US citizens over the age of 65 lacks current government issue ID. If those numbers held true in Wyoming, that'd be about 10,000 voters in the Cowboy State without a current government ID. To put a face on that, consider someone who might be in a nursing home or is homebound and doesn't live a life that requires a show ID often at all. They're not buying a lot of booze, not buying guns, not buying, not traveling on airplanes. But these folks still do find a way to vote. If you aren't aware, the age range with the highest percentage of eligible voters cast in Wyoming is between 70 and 79. The second highest group is between the ages of 60 and 69. Older Wyomingites enjoy voting. They see it as their right, and they've asked us to help them protect those rights. This year, we worked with the bill sponsors to find what we think can be a solution for protecting voter rights for older Wyomingites. That's House Bill 75's allowance for Medicare cards to be used as voter ID when there's no other available option. When you're enrolled in Medicare, you actually get a Medicare card in the mail. If you're enrolled, as most are, you get a Medicare card in the mail 3 months before your 65th birthday, or if you're on disability, after your 25th month of receiving disability payments. Medicare cards are already used as voter ID in Colorado and West Virginia. During the bill drafting process, we worked with the West Virginia Secretary of State's office to get a sense for any issues they may have had with accepting Medicare cards as ID. We're told the experience in West Virginia is the overwhelming majority of voters will use a driver's license as voter ID or a state ID. But when a license is not present, the Medicare card has been a nice backstop. Now, we also talked to our friends in Colorado. Frankly, it's been so seamless that they didn't even remember that they allowed for Medicare cards. So that's kind of good to know. We also wanted to compliment Misty Dobson and YDOT for its support, willingness to get the word out that state issued IDs will be required by 2029 and to help get citizens state ID cards to those who are eligible to receive them in the mail. This is important because it's commonplace for our members and Wyomingites who decide to stop driving to simply put the driver's license in a drawer. There's not really a great understanding that YDOT will help you get a state ID if you go to a station and tell staff specifically you're relinquishing your driver's license and would like a state ID card. Now that's an informational campaign that we'll also be making ourselves at AARP to make sure people are aware of. In conclusion, I want to thank the sponsors of the bill for helping us to find a way to keep our members voting. This interim, I believe the bill sponsors and a lot of those folks, those new folks to the legislature who came in saying that they wanted a voter ID, we're very considerate in terms of helping our members maintain their right to vote, and we very much appreciate it. So that said, I'll stand for any questions, but thank you for the consideration today.
Mr. Laycock, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, the page 4, line 10, on the valid Medicare ID card, this subdivision is repealed effective December 31, 2029. Why? Mr. Chairman, my question is, why is that sentence there? And what harm would we do if we removed it?
I don't know if we have anyone to answer that for.
Well, I was hoping Mr. Laycock did because he referred to.
Okay, Mr. Laycock, do you have an answer for that?
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Scott, that's certainly that's a policy decision that was put in by the bill sponsor. I think one of the great things about our system is if we get through a couple years down the road and we decide that we're not seeing any concerns with the Medicare card being used, we can certainly repeal that provision. If it's something that we need to revisit in a couple of years after we've got some data on how this is being used, I say that's fantastic. But it's certainly not something that AARP specifically had asked for. So that would be up to the bill sponsor.
Mr. Chairman,
Follow up.
I would extend that question to the bill sponsor, who I think wants to answer it.
Representative Gray, come on up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the thinking on that, Chairman Scott, the Medicare insurance card, and we've had some questions on this, it is the one exception on photo ID in this bill. And so my thinking was we started off because some people have the Medicare insurance card that have already renounced their driver's license. So we give a decade for that to kind of play out. And the way I thought about it is at the end of the decade, as we're celebrating the beginning of a new decade, we can also, I think it'll be a little bit better news maybe than this decade too. We can also know that we're going to have true voter ID as we go into the new decade. And I think the way it plays out, the provision that YDOT is going to be sending out in their renewal applications that voter ID is going to be, that identification is going to be required. That's going to take care of anyone that renounces their license for any reason over the next decade. And I think by the time you get to 2030, I think that education piece will be there. And I think that it'll work. That was my thinking. And then we'll have true voter ID, true voter ID. Otherwise, there is an exception in this bill. And I wanted to, acknowledge ARP's concerns, which I've acknowledged from the start are valid, but I think this concept is very important. So I thought that was a good middle ground. That's why it's in there. Thank you.
Further question, Senator Boner.
Yeah, question for either a sponsor or for AARP. What's the process one has to go through to get a Medicare card? Seems like I imagine when they don't just hand them out, they have to, contribute to the program. They have to have a social security number, but I just don't know. So more information would be helpful as far as ensuring that the folks who have these cards are who they say they are. That in my mind is the key.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, I think AARP would be a little better on the exact qualification. I will say that, you look them up and there's no photo on them, and that it is what it is. But I do think it's good to try to work to true voter ID at some point. Thank you.
Further questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Case.
Chairman.
Follow up, Senator Boner.
Yeah, I agree with the concerns, but they would be alleviated if there's a robust process to ensure that if you have that card, you are who you say they are. If there's a process to the federal government where they don't just hand these out, I'd like to know maybe from AARP what that process is. Just a little bit more information about how one gets a Medicare card.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
Maybe somebody.
We have an answer.
Being of an age that has one, frankly, it just came in the mail, and I think there may have been an application process, but they do send them based on their social security records. And they do tend to keep pretty good track of addresses that way. I did find when I lost it that replaced
a lot of things, Senator Scott.
well, I can't. But I did lose it, and the process for getting a replacement took some doing. It took several months. They're hard to deal with, but they do just send them basically. And when they sent the replacement, they just mailed the replacement. It just showed up.
Okay, sorry for the assault. Would you like to speak?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I was just wondering if we're thinking about evolving technologies. You kind of mentioned about future IDs and things like that. Have you thought about what that might look like?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Case. We made sure to fold into the driver's license definition, the digital ID into there, the new tribal ID, which partially because of the pandemic, there's been a little bit of, I think, not many have been issued since that was started. So we have the old one as well as the new one. That's kind of, I think the statutory definitions, I imagine, as we amend statutes for potential changes, we'd amend the statute as well as part of the revision.
Just to follow up a little bit, have you thought about the microchip that a lot of us already have, but some don't have? And would that be allowed? You've heard about it, haven't you?
I don't have
A
it.
lot of people have it.
I
Been
offered the
pitched to
fishing
softball,
license.
go ahead.
I offered the
Mr.
fishing
Chairman,
license.
I don't have an answer to that one.
Okay, that's a good answer.
yeah.
Thank you. Any further questions for the sponsor? I've got a comment to you. Why didn't you get one more sponsor from the Senate? You've only got 15. If you had 16, you're guaranteed.
Mr. Chairman, it's been my experience, that's not necessarily true.
We understand that. I just was picking on him a little bit. So do we have anyone else in the waiting room?
Mr. Chairman, we do. I've let in Mr. Christopher Barrel, Miss Julie Freeze, and Miss Julie Tucker.
Let's,
You're from Mr. Merrill.
thank you. Welcome.
You have to say it.
Welcome, Mr. Merrill. There we go.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, perhaps I should defer to County Clerk Freeze, or I can go if you'd like.
We're good with that. Maybe all three if you're all linked together.
I'm not linked. I'm just trying to, I'll follow your lead, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Freeze, go ahead.
And the County Clerks Association, if they want to come forward.
Yeah, Ms. Freeze, any of the county clerks we've got. See, we got one back. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if Mary Langford could go first, if she's in the room, then I'd be happy to follow up right after her, if that's okay.
Perfect. Welcome,
you.
Ms. Langford.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman,
I'll let you introduce yourselves.
and good morning, Senators. I'm Mary Langford, and I have the honor of representing the Wyoming County Clerks. With me today is Malcolm Irwin. He is the Platte County Clerk, and he's also the president of the County Clerks Association. And then on Zoom, we have the Honorable Julie Freeze, who is the Fremont County Clerk. So our purpose today is to focus on the administration of Wyoming elections and the effect of incorporating Wyoming voter ID into the process of voting. The clerks appreciate the opportunity that we have had to review drafts and to provide input into this legislation. The clerks have actively been involved in the development of engrossed House Bill 75 as it is presented to you today. With engrossed House Bill 75, a voter will be required to present an acceptable form of identification as delineated by this bill, which will then be compared by an election official to the person on the voter registration list. If everything matches, the voter will be allowed to vote. It is the association's position that all photo IDs that are acceptable for voter registration are acceptable for voter identification. This will eliminate confusion for the voters and the elected officials alike and ensure that no voter is disenfranchised or forced to purchase an acceptable identification. The County Clerks Association is satisfied that it can administer engrossed House Bill 75 voter identification as it's presented to you today. And we're happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Langford. Questions? Any questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
And I'm too blind to see who's in the waiting room.
Ms. Freeze, I don't know. Oh, and
We've Will Bartlett as well.
Bartlett from Carbon County.
Ms. Bartlett, would you like to testify? Shaking her head, no. Can't hear you. Ms. Freeze, would you like to have any comments?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Julie Freeze, Fremont County Clerk, and with the County Clerks Association. I wanted to kind of back up to some of the questions that have been asked and just try to explain a little bit on that. So to the question that you had, Senator Driscoll, Chairman Driscoll, on our voter registration form, we've already been working on, if this were to pass, how we would handle that on our level. And there would be a position area where we would want the election judges to put what ID they saw. So I go back to, I've been in elections quite a few years, and back in the day when you had to take somebody off the list, but you also wrote them down in a book. I recall somebody who got a purge notice that said, by gosh, I was there and I was standing behind so-and-so, and we went and looked at the records, and sure enough, they had somebody else's name there. Well, they thought that the person who was standing in line was somebody they knew, and they really made a mistake. So we want to make sure our election judges are putting down, seeing the ID of every single person and putting that down on the list. And I think that that goes to the equity of all voters. We don't want anybody saying, oh, well, you'll not take their ID, but you make me take the ID. So I think it's really important that we see ID on every single voter. A reminder that the provisional process, so if I don't bring my ID or I can't produce that at the election, we will give them a provisional ballot, and they will be required by 5 o'clock the next day to bring that to us. And we will take that information and take it to the canvass board and decide whether or not to vote their ballot. I do want to say on the tribal ID, the reason we went backwards on that a little bit is because the one tribe was able to, the Arapahoes were able to put the driver's license and the social security on their card. The Eastern Shoshone were not yet. The other problem with that is once your ID expires, which is now 4 years for both tribes, then people can do that. So not a lot of people are jumping to go change their ID right now. And so we wanted to make sure, again, it has a picture and it is looks a lot more like our driver's license. And I felt like that was a really good ID the way it was, not the new way that was passed last year. And that brings me to, the picture ID is exactly what you said, is I want to make sure that the person that's standing in front of me is the person that the picture is on the card and the name that is on there. I know in our county for sure, we ask the person who's standing in front of us to give us all the information that should be on our list. We don't do it the other way around. So if you are who you say you are, that should be fairly simple. On Senator Nethercott's question about how we will handle that, first of all, we are working really hard in the Clerks Association to do a lot of uniformity rules across the state. I believe this would definitely be one of those. I would have to say too, I'd like to get people more used to turning in problems to us at the clerk's office. I can fix something like that on election day if people will let me know that those kind of things are happening. First of all, unless you were registering to vote, which I doubt you were, then you should not have been asked for your ID. And you should have, at that time, because there was no requirement for that, you should have turned that into your county clerk, because we can fix those kind of things as soon as we know. If we don't know, we can't fix them the next day. And my final thing is basically to follow up with what Mary said. And as long as we leave all of the amendments that have been passed in the House onto this bill, us as clerks are able to administer this legislation if it were to pass. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Questions from Ms. Freeze? Seeing none, thank you. Ms. Bartlett, did you not want to testify, or you do? There we go. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gwen Bartlett, Carbon County Clerk. I was here more just for questions, but I did want to clarify one thing that I think you said earlier. If there is a challenge on election day of a voter's identity, they have until 5 p.m. the following day to clarify that with us or to rectify the matter, bring forward their ID to us. We don't look back at a voter ID that may or may not have been presented when they registered to vote. And so I just wanted to clarify that they would have to show that ID to us in person, like on the day following.
Thank you. Great. Any questions for Ms. Bartlett? Seeing none. Did we have someone else in the waiting room? Mr. Winnie, would you like to come up while we're waiting to admit someone if they're there? Welcome. I'll go ahead and let you start if we got someone. Yeah, we do have someone coming. You can go ahead and start, Mr. Winnie.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Bill Winnie, Sublette County. One thing that has been mentioned thus far in the legislation, if I read the legislation correctly, is military members and the federal postcard application that they would send in. I did that many, many years. Mary Langford in the back of the room probably tracked me halfway around the world and back as I voted. I would note for the committee's information that when you fill out that card, it's required to have a signature on it by a commissioned officer or your personnel officer in your unit that verifies they went to the service record and verified your state of residency. And so there's a document in there. It's not the document labeled home of record. It's a different document. And it just says where your state is. And that's required by the Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief Act that you declare a state, usually for income tax purposes, but you declare it regardless. They check that, they countersign that card for you. The state is required to accept that by federal law, but it's not a big deal. So subject to your questions, thank you very much.
Question for Mr. Winnie. Seeing none, thank you. Mr. Merrill is in the waiting room, I believe. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Chris Merrill. I'm the Executive Director of the Equality State Policy Center. I'm here today to speak in loyal opposition to this bill. Mr. Chairman, the fact is not lost on me that more than half the entire legislature has signed on as a co-sponsor of this bill. But I think it's important, given this apparent overwhelming support, that this committee consider a few big picture considerations during your deliberations today. First and most importantly, this bill is based on a false premise. It's a bill that seeks to fix a problem that doesn't exist in Wyoming. Like many of you, I've sat through the hearings on this bill and a few other bills like it in recent years, and I've listened to the testimony from the county clerks, the Secretary of State's office, election officials, volunteer poll workers, etc. And we've never heard anyone assert or provide any evidence that so-called voter fraud, which this bill purports to prevent, is a problem in Wyoming. In fact, the consensus is the opposite. There's no such problem. The consensus is that when it comes to integrity and security, we have a pretty darn good, sound system of elections here in Wyoming. And all the evidence says that voters and election officials participate with integrity and out of a sense of civic pride and duty. And yet, Wyoming has been drawn into this national trend of impugning the motives of voters and casting doubt on the integrity of our vote counts, again, with no evidence, and sometimes even straight up misinformation. So I guess the main thing I want to say today, Mr. Chairman, is that yes, there is a threat to our system of elections in this country, but it's definitely not the voters. It's not regular people. It's certainly not the county clerks. It's not election officials. It's not our volunteers. It's not our great American system of democracy, which has stood the test of time and has been the beacon for so long for the rest of the world. The real threat, Mr. Chairman, is cynical, prominent, powerful elected officials on the national level who in bad faith fabricate unfounded stories and seek to misinform the public about unsubstantiated so-called voter fraud. That's the real threat. And the singular goal of this national level campaign is to undermine our faith as American people in the integrity of our elections. And that's a dangerous thing going on these days when it comes to our elections. And I believe, Mr. Chairman, we ignore it or we let it slide at our peril. We have an existing robust system of elections already in place in this state. And so I'd argue that the most basic best practice when it comes to considering voting laws within this context is to first do no harm. Another best practice is to ensure that whatever decisions we make in terms of legislation, we don't unnecessarily make it harder for people to vote. So rather than spending our energies and resources focusing on non-existent problems and unjustly impugning the motives of voters, we should be working instead to increase voter turnout and make it as easy as possible for people to vote. We do not have a voter fraud problem in Wyoming. We have a voter participation problem. And we should be doing everything we can to encourage and enable more voters, more eligible voters to vote. On the other hand, one surefire way of decreasing faith in voter turnout even further, and we saw this in the recent Georgia runoffs, would be to let the lies and the misinformation stand unchallenged. Let voters continue to be deceived by these cynical tactics. Let voters lose faith. Let more and more people believe these fanciful stories. The whole thing is rigged.
You stick pretty tightly to the bill. We're getting a pretty good speech. I'm happy to take comments on the bill, but I don't need a political speech. Thank you.
This bill is being promoted, Mr. Chairman, as a way to restore faith. I just think that that's hogwash, because this bill says implicitly that these stories of voter fraud are real, that voters really can't be trusted, that we need to fix something that isn't broken. So this solution before you today is an implicit perpetuation of the misinformation we've all been bombarded with in recent years, which is why, Mr. Chairman, I urge you to vote no on this bill of 1,000 co-sponsors, and I'll conclude my testimony. And I'm happy to try to answer any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Merrill. I have one comment. In front of this committee, don't ever pass again to be the last one to testify. That's when we admit you to the room, if you've got a good reason, but to be the last one does not work. I've got grief for it.
Mr. Chairman, I think he was allowing elected officials to go first.
Okay, I didn't take it that way. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, my intention was to allow the elected officials and the County Clerks Association to go.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Scott.
I will comment that I did find some of his comments to be offensive. I think there have been some problems, real problems elsewhere. I've seen them when I was living elsewhere, but that was a number of years ago. And I think doing a little preventive medicine is sometimes a very good idea.
Further comments?
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the comments from Mr. Merrill. Getting a different perspective is certainly helpful and productive. Thank you for participating in the legislative process, Mr. Merrill. Appreciate hearing from you.
Thank you.
Sermon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. My name is Marguerite Herman. I'm here for the League of Women Voters, and I'll be extremely brief. I'm speaking in opposition to the bill. The League opposes this voter ID bill. After months of a national effort to paint elections in Wyoming and elsewhere as fatally flawed, and after weeks of efforts to make a voter ID law somehow fit our state, please put this bill out of its misery. The League of Women Voters of Wyoming opposes this measure and asks Senate corporations to vote no today. The only accomplishment of HB 75 is to create a hoop for voters and poll workers. And I emphasize the poll workers at the election to jump through on election day, excuse me, with no corresponding benefit. Our voter registration system is solid. Our elections are secure. Our turnout is disappointing, and it seems an extra hoop doesn't do anything but possibly make that worse. Possibly. If we want to increase confidence of Wyoming voters in their elections, we could all start by standing up and attesting to the fact that we don't have a problem with impersonations at the polls. That might go some way to restoring some confidence. In any case, voter ID is a hoop for its own sake, it seems, and Wyoming should have no patience for such an expenditure of time, effort, and other resources. And I would just comment along the lines of, I know it's facetious, about the ID chip, but I guess we're approaching the day when we'll have facial recognition, and all this will be simply pushing a button. But we're not there yet, and it sounds like this is not a Wyoming. This does not really address the situation that we have in Wyoming. So I just ask you to vote no.
Question from Ms. Herman. Thank you. Nice job. Further testimony in the audience, Mr. Moline. This is about cows and dirt, right?
I'm trying to be brief and you got me, Mr. Chairman. It happened before. I hope it won't happen again this morning. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, being a general ag organization, we do have policy on a lot of different issues. I'll try to be as brief as possible. This is a good bill. I wholeheartedly agree with the Chairman Scott's comments about being preventative and preemptive, and also the comments of the Secretary of State along those same lines. Mr. Chairman, trying to be brief, sitting in support of this bill, and for that, I would sit for any questions from you or the committee.
Question from Ms. Moline.
Thank you.
Being none, thank you. Further testimony. Welcome. I don't remember your name again. I apologize.
Cassie Craven. Good morning,
Thank you,
Mr.
Ms.
Chairman.
Craven.
Cassie Craven with the Wyoming Liberty Group here today. Just with regard to the legal points surrounding this bill, I wanted to testify on that. The Seventh Circuit has very clearly said that fraud is parallel to littering, another crime that the perpetrators of which are almost impossible to catch. That's coming from the Seventh Circuit Court, and what they prescribed as a measure is either stricter criminal penalties or preventative measures, such as we see here. I've also had the opportunity to review this bill in comparison to the Supreme Court precedent on it in the Crawford and McCrory courts. I don't think there's any due process concerns. I think that the fact that all these stakeholders came together allows us significant legal protection. I think that this is a very sound legal bill that will not be challenged or could not be challenged. And just in closing, I'd like to note that the Commission on Federal Election Reform, which was headed by former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker, said in 2005 that the electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if there's no safeguards in place. And so I think even though we have a lot of different perspectives, at the end of the day, this bill really does help everybody because it does increase voter turnout, voter confidence. There's been several studies, even from the Heritage Foundation very recently, that disprove the whole notion that people turn out less when there's voter ID, and they looked specifically at minorities as well. So there's just no evidence to back up those assertions. So I'd stand for any questions. Thank you.
Question for Ms. Craven. Seeing none, thank you. Ms. Simons, come forward, please. Welcome.
Step stool. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Gail Simmons. I am a blogger with Civics 307, a nonprofit blog on the legislature and civics in Wyoming. I am on and for this bill. I do have some concerns in that I used to teach statistics when I was way out of my wheelhouse, but I did that when I was in the Six Sigma program in General Electric. And so one of the ways that we taught that was around alpha and beta errors. And so when you're doing statistics, you're not proving something, you're disproving something. So an alpha error is when you include something that you shouldn't, and a beta error is the opposite. And when we're doing statistics, we give twice as much leeway for error for a beta than an alpha. And so the way that I would give that to the students is in our court system, when it comes to finding somebody guilty, we have an OJ or a hurricane. And the idea is that we will give twice the amount of error in having a guilty person go free than we will on a hurricane, which is to find guilty someone who is not. And the point that I'm making is that we need to ensure when we're providing greater confidence through this ID, that we have every safeguard in place, every communication, every capability, every process to ensure that every individual who has not the right, because apparently that's not in our Constitution, but can vote in the state of Wyoming is not turned away for lack of an ID. So we need to absolutely ensure that whatever we do upon passage of this bill, that it's not just a letter from YDOT, which frankly, if it's not, I'm going to toss it. So I just encourage that we really work through that. I gave you an eye chart. I was really curious on the voter ID. So I went out and I looked to see what it would cost to have a voter ID. Where this came from is that if somebody doesn't have a driver's license, and my understanding is that of the individuals who register to vote in Wyoming with a driver's license, 30% of them are an out-of-state license. And it's, I think I heard something like 3 to 5% do not have a driver's license. I don't think people should have to go to the YDOT to get a Wyoming ID, which in Sheridan is all the way out at the other end of town, and wait however many weeks to get an ID. And I thought, why can't we just give a secure ID at the time that they register, when they've given their documents? So with that premise in mind, I went to see how much that would cost. And that's what you have on this eye chart. Basically, for an entire setup, and this is a setup for a secure government ID, it costs less for other ones. It's only $2,400 and it's only 10.4 pounds. You're talking something fairly small. So I went to see how many new registers we had in 2020. And you see the results here. 30% that need ID was 15,000. I took how many systems they would need, how many of the printer ribbons and cards and sliders and all. And what you see is that to provide that capability at the elections office, when they come in and register, it comes to less than $100,000 to cover 2 years. $100,000. That's only $6.31 per ID, as opposed to the $10 when we tell them they have to go all the way the heck out of town in order to get something and wait for months. So I don't know that this needs to be in here. I think that this is something worth looking at. Instead of having a laundry list of IDs, we actually have the ability to reduce it down. But my biggest concern is, while I'm in support of this, is a very strong statement that it's not just enough to send letters out. At 10.4 pounds, the elections clerk could make arrangements to go to the senior center if they had to, and get those IDs. So it provides some additional capabilities. I'm not actually saying add this in right now, but I do want to reemphasize how important it is that we do not, in our zeal to ensure that there's no voter fraud at the polls, that we aren't excluding folks. And I just asked, and it turned out that our system does allow the voter registration system actually does pull a file in that can take the ID. So if somebody's lost theirs, there's actually one on file. So there is some support there. So anyway, I've gone longer than I expected, but I stand for questions.
Thank you. Question for Simmons.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
One very quick comment with regard to your first sentence. With regard to the constitutional right to vote, look at Article 1, Sections 2, and particularly Section 3.
Mr. Chairman, I looked because I wanted that, and even the 14th Amendment just talks about how you can't abridge it. It doesn't say you have it. So, but I love that. I think everybody should vote, but it's a right and a privilege.
Mr. Chairman, the reference to the Wyoming Constitution article.
Oh, perfect.
Article 1 and Sections 2 and 3, particularly Section 3.
Thank you. Further questions?
Even more important than your gun.
Okay. Any more testimony, either online, if you do it, raise your hand, or in the crowd?
Mr. Chairman, we have two currently waiting to testify online, Ms. Sherry Lau and Julie Tucker.
Okay, let's bring them in.
Time of 2 minutes each.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes. We've got 10 minutes left to finish this, so we'll do a couple minutes each.
Tell them their testimony is limited to 2 minutes.
So your testimony will be 2 minutes. Welcome, Ms. Lau. I hope I didn't mess your name up. Welcome.
Yes, it will. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee. I am Sherry from Campbell County, Wyoming. Wyoming has stringent voter laws already on the books, and persons presenting themselves to vote must verify their address when asked by the person at the check-in. The comment about during testimony this morning about, well, they can cast a provisional ballot, kind of doesn't consider the things that many people travel long distances to vote, sometimes maybe in a hurry. And if they're already registered to vote and can verify their address, they should be good to go. This current legislative session has addressed the rights of unborn children, the rights of folks who do not want to wear masks. HB 75 tramples on the rights of our citizens who are eligible to vote and shows fear for allowing democracy to work. Voting law violations do not happen in Wyoming. The new law is not needed. I urge the committee to vote no on advancing the bill or this bill. And I stand for questions. Thank you.
Questions for Ms. Lau? Thank you. Go ahead. Yeah, thank you very much for being short.
Thank you.
We have a Mr. Tucker, I believe.
Good morning, sir.
Ms. Tucker, thank
Good
you.
morning, Chairman Driscoll and committee. My name is Julie Tucker, and I am speaking as an individual this morning. I will shorten myself up just a little bit here for you. I've come here today to ask for your help on this bill because I have a concern. We have many compromised and disabled citizens who are on Medicaid, which leaves them homebound or in a skilled nursing facility. Because they are in an inclusive environment, they don't have access to most, if not all, of the IDs listed here. I feel that we are leaving out a population of our most vulnerable voters as citizens of our state. Would it be possible for them to use their Medicaid card as a form of ID? Would you please consider an amendment to this bill adding that form of identification? As the Medicaid card, or as the Medicare card, a Medicaid card is also issued by the government. And as you probably well know,
Sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Tucker. It's in the bill.
not Medicaid, Medicare is.
Medicaid. Okay, thank you. Continue on, my bad.
Okay, sir, thank you. I'm done. Thank you for letting me speak, and I stand for questions.
Questions, good point. Questions. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, sir.
Scott, hold on for one second.
No, and
Okay,
Mr. Chairman, are we through with public testimony? I want to move the bill.
we are.
Mr. Chairman,
Bill has been moved.
I move the bill.
Amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I suggest the Medicaid suggestion be taken under advisement and somebody could bring a committee of the whole amendment if that's a valid consideration.
Seems to be.
Couldn't we just add it real quick? Make it a 9, Romanet 9 on page 4, coming after line 11, just the same language that is there for the Medicare. Do the same thing for the
Say I
Medicaid.
move.
I move that.
Okay, it's been
Okay.
moved. Discussion?
Question.
Question called. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion's passed. We're back on the bill.
Question on the bill.
Senator Boner.
No, I'm ready to vote.
Okay, question called. Roll call.
Ms. Eatman, you have that amendment?
We'll get it.
Yes, I think
Okay.
so.
It's not-
Senator Boner,
Aye.
Senator Case,
No.
Senator Nethercott,
Aye.
Senator Scott,
Aye.
Chairman Driscoll.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, House Bill 75 passes as amended with 4 ayes and 1 no.
Thank you. We're adjourned. Representative Gray, thank you. Interestingly enough, it's a current issue. My first bill in front of the legislature 12 years ago was voter ID. I was railed out of the room